October 1950. The Oval Office. The rain lashed against the bulletproof glass of the Oval Office, distorting the lights of Washington, D.C. into smeared, weeping streaks of yellow and gray. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and high-tension sweat. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, sat behind the resolute desk, a glass of bourbon untouched near his right hand. He wasn't a tall man. He wasn't a handsome man. He didn't have the patrician grace of Roosevelt or the military jawline of Washington. He was a haberdasher from Missouri who had gone bankrupt, a man who had ascended to the presidency only because a giant had died. But Harry Truman had something that his enemies constantly underestimated, a spine made of pure, unalloyed steel. And right now, that spine was being tested by a man 5,000 miles away. "Read it again, Dean," Truman said, his voice low, deceptively calm. He was rubbing his temples, where a headache had been throbbing for 3 days. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, stood by the fireplace. He looked like an aristocrat, but tonight his face was pale. He held a communique that had just come over the wire from Tokyo. "Mr. President," Acheson began, "General MacArthur states that the restrictions placed upon his forces are an unprecedented handicap without parallel in military history. He implies that Washington is timid." Truman swiveled his chair around. The leather creaked loudly in the silence of the room. "Timid," Truman repeated. He picked up his bourbon, swirled it, but didn't drink. "I dropped 2 atomic bombs to end a world war. I commit American boys to save South Korea from the Reds, and Douglas MacArthur calls me timid." General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, cleared his throat. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who understood the chain of command. To him, what was happening was blasphemy. "Harry," Bradley said, dropping the formalities, "it's worse than that. He's sending letters to the veterans of foreign wars. He's talking to the press. He's running his own foreign policy from the Daiichi building. He thinks he's the Emperor of Japan, not a supreme commander." Truman slammed his hand on the desk. The sound was like a pistol shot. Is the Emperor out there?" Truman snapped. "That's the problem. We built him up. We let him have his way because he wins. But now he's talking about invading China. He's talking about expanding the war. He's talking about World War III like it's a bridge game." Truman stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the rose garden, beaten down by the autumn rain. "I have to meet him," Truman said. "Face to face. Eye to eye. I need to see if the man is deaf or just stupid, because I'm the commander-in-chief, and he's treating me like a clerk. He won't come to Washington, Mr. President," Acheson warned. "He claims his duties in Korea are too pressing. He'll say he can't leave the front." Truman turned, a grim smile playing on his lips. "I know. That's why I'm going to him. Or halfway, at least. Wake Island. It's a speck of coral in the middle of nowhere. If I fly 7,000 miles to meet him, he can't refuse." "It will look like you are bowing to him," Bradley cautioned. "The president traveling to the general? It sets a bad precedent." "Let it look how it looks," Truman said, his eyes hardening behind his thick spectacles. "I don't care about the optics. I care about the Constitution. I'm going to look that son of a BTCH in the eye, and I'm going to find out if he intends to obey his orders." The Daiichi building, Tokyo. 2 days later, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur stood before a wall-sized map of the Korean peninsula. He was 70 years old, but he stood with the posture of a man half his age. He wore his trademark corncob pipe, his khaki uniform perfectly pressed, his hair carefully combed over his bald spot. He was a legend. He was the hero of the Pacific. He had returned to the Philippines. He had accepted the Japanese surrender. And now, he had pulled off the miracle at Incheon, an amphibious landing that everyone said was impossible, crushing the North Korean army in a single stroke. He didn't just believe in his own myth, he lived it. "Wake Island," MacArthur mused, blowing a cloud of fragrant smoke into the air. "The little man wants to meet at Wake Island." Major General Courtney Whitney, his sycophantic aide, chuckled. "It's a political stunt, General. The midterm elections are coming up. Truman needs to be seen with a winner. He wants to rub some of your gold dust on his gray suit." MacArthur turned. His eyes were icy blue, devoid of doubt. "It isn't a position. I am fighting a war. I have North Koreans on the run. The Chinese are bluffing. And yet, I must fly to a desolate rock to explain military strategy to a man who never rose above the rank of captain in the artillery. You could refuse, Whitney suggested. No, MacArthur said, adjusting his collar. I will go. I will give him his photo opportunity. I will let him feel important. And then I will return and finish this war my way. By Christmas, the boys will be home. And Truman will be a footnote. MacArthur walked to the window, looking out over the ruined, rebuilding city of Tokyo. He felt the weight of destiny on his shoulders. He genuinely believed he was the only thing standing between Christian civilization and the red horde of communism. To him, Truman wasn't just a boss, he was an obstacle. A small-minded politician who didn't understand the grand sweep of history. Pack my things, Courtney, MacArthur commanded. But tell the pilot to take his time. Let the president wait on the tarmac. It's good for him to remember who is actually running the Pacific. Wake Island, October 15th, 1950. The heat on Wake Island was oppressive. The sun beat down on the coral airstrip, shimmering in waves of distortion. The Independence, the presidential aircraft, had landed early. Truman, ever the early riser, was already awake, shaved, and dressed in a double-breasted suit despite the tropical heat. He sat in the Quonset hut that served as the administration building, checking his watch. He's late, Truman muttered to Bradley. He's circling, sir, Bradley said, looking out the window with binoculars. His plane, the Bataan, has been in the pattern for 20 minutes. He's waiting for you to come out to the tarmac before he lands. Truman's jaw tightened. It was a power play, a petty, schoolyard power play. MacArthur wanted the President of the United States to stand in the hot sun and wait for him like a servant. Let him circle until he runs out of gas, Truman said, opening a file. I'm not moving. It took another 15 minutes before the Bataan finally touched down. The roar of the engines filled the small island. Truman waited until the propellers stopped spinning before he stood up. All right, Truman said, adjusting his tie. Let's go see the great man. They walked out to the plane. The door of the Bataan opened. MacArthur appeared. He didn't wear a salute. He didn't wear a formal uniform. He wore his battered, open-neck shirt, his famous cap soaked in scrambled egg gold braid, and his sunglasses. He looked like a movie star descending from Olympus. Truman walked toward him. He extended his hand. MacArthur walked down the stairs. He paused. He looked at the president. He didn't salute. For a soldier, the salute is sacred. It is the recognition of authority. By not saluting the commander-in-chief, MacArthur was spitting on the Constitution. The silence on the tarmac was deafening. The reporters, the aides, the Secret Service, everyone held their breath. Truman didn't flinch. He kept his hand extended, his eyes locked on MacArthur's sunglasses. Mr. President, MacArthur said finally, his voice deep and theatrical. He took Truman's hand. He didn't squeeze it. He held it like a king granting an audience to a subject. General, Truman said. His voice was flat. I've been waiting. I had headwinds, MacArthur lied smoothly. They got into a battered Chevrolet sedan to drive to the meeting hut. The ride was short and excruciatingly awkward. I hope you don't mind the heat, Mr. President, MacArthur said. It's nothing compared to the heat of battle. I've seen battle, General, Truman replied, reminding him of World War I. I know what heat is. When they reached the hut, they went into a private room. Just the two of them. No odds. No reporters. No estenographers. This was the moment. Truman sat down and leaned forward. General, I want the truth. No flowery language. No speeches. I need to know about the Chinese. MacArthur took out his pipe. He began to fill it with agonizing slowness. The Chinese, he scoffed. Mr. President, the Chinese will not intervene. They have missed their window. If they try to cross the Yalu River, I will unleash the Air Force. It will be the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. Our intelligence says they are massing on the border, Truman pressed. 300,000 men. Peasants, MacArthur dismissed. No Air Force. No artillery. If they come in, we will destroy them. The war is over, Mr. President. The North Koreans are broken. I will have the boys home by Christmas. You have my word. Truman watched him. He wanted to believe him. Every political instinct in Truman's body wanted the war to be over. He wanted the victory. And what about the Soviets? Truman asked. The Russians? MacArthur laughed. They are afraid of us. They won't move. You worry too much about the politics, Harry. Let me handle the fighting. Harry. He had called the president by his first name. It was a calculated slip, a reminder that MacArthur considered himself an equal, if not a superior. Truman felt the anger bubbling in his chest, hot and acidic. But he swallowed it. He needed MacArthur. The public loved him. To fire him now, when he was promising victory, would be political suicide. Very well, General, Truman said, standing up. I will hold you to that. Home by Christmas. They walked out of the room. The meeting had lasted less than an hour. On the surface, it was a reconciliation. They smiled for the cameras. Truman pinned a medal on MacArthur's chest. They shook hands again. But as the Independence took off, banking over the blue Pacific Ocean, Truman looked down at the shrinking figure of MacArthur on the tarmac. He's a liar, Truman said to Bradley. Sir, he's lying to himself, Truman said, unbuttoning his collar. He thinks he's infallible. He thinks the Chinese are scared of his shadow. He didn't salute me, Omar. Did you see that? He didn't salute. I saw it, sir. Truman poured himself a bourbon. His hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from suppressed rage. He promised me the Chinese wouldn't come in, Truman whispered, looking into the amber liquid. But if he's wrong, if that son of a BTCH is wrong, God help us all. 2 weeks later, the Yalu River. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The wind howled through the mountains of North Korea, freezing the oil in the jeeps and the coffee in the canteens. American soldiers, confident in their general's promise, were advancing toward the river that separated Korea from China. They were thinking about turkey dinners and Christmas trees. They had left their heavy winter gear behind to move faster. They didn't see the movement in the snow-covered hills. They didn't see the thousands of white-clad figures lying in wait, perfectly camouflaged. They didn't hear the breathing of 300,000 Chinese soldiers who had crossed the river under the cover of darkness. MacArthur was in Tokyo, planning a victory parade. Truman was in Washington, sleeping fitfully. And then the bugles sounded, a terrifying, discordant sound that echoed through the frozen valleys. The snow on the hillsides seemed to stand up. The Chinese army didn't trickle in. They crashed down like an avalanche. The peasants MacArthur had mocked were hardening veterans of a 20-year civil war. They hit the American lines with the force of a sledgehammer. The trap had been sprung. The disaster that Truman had feared, the disaster MacArthur had sworn was impossible, had begun. And in the White House, the phone on the president's bedside table began to ring. It was a ring that signaled the end of the polite war and the beginning of the real war, the war between the president and the general. Hell had frozen over. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero. It was so cold that morphine syrettes had to be kept in soldiers' mouths to keep them from freezing solid. It was so cold that if a man sweated, the perspiration would turn to ice inside his clothes and kill him. The 1st Marine Division was surrounded. They were trapped in a bowl of jagged mountains, encircled by 10 divisions of the Chinese 9th Army. The enemy came in waves, blowing whistles and bugles in the dark, swarming over the frozen ground like ants. Private Miller, a 19-year-old from Ohio, huddled in a foxhole that was barely a scrape in the rock-hard earth. His rifle was jammed. His boots were frozen to his feet. Home by Christmas, he whispered, his lips cracked and bleeding. That's what the general said. Home by Christmas. A mortar shell exploded nearby, sending a plume of black snow into the air. Miller looked at the body of his sergeant, frozen stiff in the snow next to him. The sergeant had died 3 days ago, but the ground was too hard to dig a grave. This was the reality of Douglas MacArthur's promise. The greatest military disaster since Bull Run was unfolding in real time. The peasants were slaughtering the finest troops in the American army. In Tokyo, the radiator in the Daiichi building was hissing with warmth. Douglas MacArthur paced the floor, his face gray. The myth of infallibility had been shattered. But MacArthur did not do what ordinary men do. He did not accept responsibility. He did not say, I was wrong. Instead, he panicked. And then, he blamed everyone else. We face an entirely new war. MacArthur shouted into the phone to the Joint Chiefs in Washington. The Chinese force is limitless. They are pouring across the Yalu. Unless I am given the authority to strike their bases in Manchuria, unless I can bomb their supply lines, this command will be destroyed. General Collins' voice crackled over the line from the Pentagon. The president has been clear. We cannot attack Chinese soil. That would bring the Soviet Union into the war. We are trying to contain the conflict. Contain? MacArthur roared. You cannot contain a flood. You must dam it at the source. I need reinforcements. I need to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's forces from Taiwan. And I need discretion regarding the use of atomic capabilities. The line went silent. Did you hear me? MacArthur demanded. If we do not act, the blood of these boys is on Washington's hands. He slammed the phone down. He looked at his aide, Whitney. They're selling us out, Courtney. They're letting the communists win because they are afraid. Truman is a coward. He'd rather see American boys die in the snow than offend Stalin. MacArthur walked to the map. He didn't see a tactical retreat. He saw a betrayal. And in his mind, the only way to save his reputation was to expand the war so massively that victory, or total destruction, was the only option. He wanted to drop radioactive waste along the Yalu River. He wanted to nuke Chinese cities. He was ready to burn the world to save his legacy. The White House, January 1951. Harry Truman looked 10 years older than he had 2 months ago. He wasn't sleeping. He would wake up at 4 a.m., go to his study, and read the casualty reports. Every name was a knife in his gut. He's asking for 34 atomic bombs, Truman said, tossing a top-secret file onto the desk. General Marshall, now the Secretary of Defense, nodded gravely. He has submitted a list of targets. He wants to create a radioactive belt across the Korean peninsula. He believes it will stop the Chinese advance. He believes? Truman scoffed. He believed the Chinese wouldn't fight. He believed the war was over. Why in God's name should I trust his judgment on starting a nuclear holocaust? Truman poured a glass of water. His hand was trembling. George, Truman said to Marshall, if we do this, if we drop the bomb, the Russians will take Europe. They'll roll into Berlin the next day. This isn't just about Korea. MacArthur sees the world through a soda straw. He doesn't see the big picture. MacArthur is leaking to the press again, Atchison added, stepping into the room. He gave an interview to U.S. News and World Report. He criticized the restrictions on his command. He practically called your policy appeasement. Truman's face turned a dark shade of red. Appeasement? I'm the one who stood up to Stalin. I'm the one who saved Greece and Turkey. Who the hell does he think he is? He thinks he is the government, Atchison said quietly. And the Republicans agree with him. The public loves him, Mr. President. If you fire him now, they'll impeach you. They'll say you're soft on communism. They'll say you're jealous of a real hero. Truman sat down heavily. He felt the walls of the Oval Office closing in. He was trapped between a disastrous war abroad and a political civil war at home. I can't fire him for being wrong, Truman said, rubbing his eyes. A general is allowed to be wrong, but I can fire him for insubordination. I can fire him for defying the commander-in-chief. He hasn't crossed that line yet, Marshall warned. Not fully. He's walking the edge. If you move against him without absolute proof of insubordination, you will destroy your presidency. Then we wait, Truman growled. We wait for him to hang himself. Because a man with an ego that big, he won't be able to keep his mouth shut for long. March 1951. The turning point. The war had stabilized. Under the command of General Matthew Ridgway, a man who actually followed orders, the U.S. forces had stopped the retreat and started pushing back. Seoul was recaptured. The Chinese offensive had stalled. Truman saw a window for peace. He drafted a statement. It was a ceasefire proposal, an olive branch to the Chinese. It said that the United Nations was willing to negotiate to return to the status quo. It was a chance to stop the killing without starting World War III. He sent a copy of the draft to Tokyo as a courtesy. Douglas MacArthur read the draft. He saw it for what it was, an end to the war without total victory, an end that would leave him without his triumph. They're suing for peace, MacArthur spat. They are begging on their knees. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't consult Washington. On March 24th, MacArthur issued his own statement to the world. It was a proclamation. In it, he taunted the Chinese. He insulted their military capacity. He threatened that if they didn't surrender, he would expand the war to their coastal cities and bring about their inevitable collapse. It was an ultimatum, and it completely torpedoed Truman's peace initiative. When the news hit the teletype in the White House, Dean Acheson read it and felt the blood drain from his face. He walked into the president's study. Truman was reading a book on the Civil War. "Mr. President," Acheson said, "he's done it." Truman read the transcript of MacArthur's statement. He read it once. Then he read it again. He carefully closed his book. He took off his glasses and placed them on the table. "He just declared war on China," Truman whispered. "I'm trying to make peace, and my general tells the enemy that I'm going to blow them up." "It's sabotage," Acheson said. "He knew about your proposal. He did this deliberately to wreck it." Truman stood up. The calm was gone. The little man from Missouri was gone. In his place was a man of pure, cold fury. "This isn't just insubordination," Truman said. "This is treason. He's trying to force my hand. He wants to drag me into a war I don't want to fight." "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Truman said. "But he's pushing me. He's pushing me to the edge." But MacArthur wasn't done. He had one more card to play. One final act of defiance that would force the greatest constitutional crisis of the 20th century. April 5th, 1951. The Martin Letter. Joseph Martin was the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives. He was a fierce critic of Truman. He had written to MacArthur, asking for his views on the war, specifically on the use of Chiang Kai-shek's forces. MacArthur could have ignored the letter. He could have written a polite, non-committal reply. That was what a soldier was supposed to do, stay out of politics. Instead, MacArthur wrote back, "It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest. If we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. There is no substitute for victory." He authorized Martin to read the letter on the floor of Congress. It was a direct attack on the president's policy. It was a general telling the Congress that the commander-in-chief was wrong, weak, and dangerous. The letter was read aloud on April 5th. The press went wild. The White House. April 6th, 1951. Friday morning. Truman sat at the head of the table in the cabinet room. Around him were his war council, Marshall, Bradley, Acheson, and Harriman. Truman placed the newspaper containing the Martin letter on the table. He smoothed it out with his palm. "I want to know," Truman said, looking at each man in turn, "what we're going to do about this." The room was silent. They all knew what should be done, but they were terrified of the consequences. MacArthur was a god to the American people. Truman's approval rating was 26%. "If you fire him," Harriman said, "the Republicans will crucify you. They will impeach you." "I don't give a damn about the Republicans." Truman snapped. "I care about the Constitution. The Constitution says the president runs the military, not the other way around. If a general can dictate policy to the president, then we don't have a democracy anymore. We have a dictatorship." He looked at General Marshall. "George, what do you say?" Marshall sighed. "Mr. President, he has violated his orders. He has challenged your authority. From a military standpoint, he should be relieved. But the political fallout, to hell with the politics." Truman slammed his fist on the table. "I've taken enough. I've taken his insults. I've taken his arrogance. I've taken his mistakes that cost thousands of lives. But I will not sit here and let him tell the world that the president doesn't matter." Truman stood up and paced the room. He looked small in the large room, but his shadow stretched long across the floor. "I've made up my mind," Truman said. The room went deathly still. "I'm going to fire him," Truman said. "I'm going to fire the son of a BTCH right now." Bradley cleared his throat. "Sir, we should draft the orders carefully. We need the Joint Chiefs to be unanimous. We need to make sure the legal ground is solid." "You get your ducks in a row," Truman said, his eyes blazing. But he's done. I want him out. I want him stripped of his command. I want him back in civilian clothes so fast his head spins. When Atchison asked, immediately, Truman said, I don't want him to resign. I don't want him to retire with dignity. I want him fired. I want the world to know that Harry Truman is the president and Douglas MacArthur is just a soldier who forgot his place. The plan was set. They would send the order through secure channels to Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, who was in Korea. Pace would deliver the news to MacArthur in person, quietly, before the press found out. It was a decent plan. It was a dignified plan. But nothing with Douglas MacArthur ever went according to plan. April 10th, 1951. Late night. A breakdown in communications. The teletype in Korea failed. Pace never got the message. But in Washington, a leak sprung. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune got wind that something big was happening. The story was about to break. Truman was in the Blair House. The White House was being renovated. It was late. Bradley called him. Mr. President, the story is leaking. If we don't announce it now, MacArthur will hear on the radio before we can tell him officially. Truman didn't hesitate. He was done with courtesy. He was done with protocol. Let him hear it on the radio, Truman said coldly. Call a press conference. Release the statement. Do it now. It was 1 a.m. in Washington. It was 3 p.m. in Tokyo. General MacArthur was having lunch with his wife and guests at the American Embassy. He was eating a steak. He was laughing, telling a story about the Philippines. An aide rushed into the room. He was pale. He turned on the radio. The voice of the announcer filled the room. President Truman has announced, with deep regret, that he has relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of his commands. MacArthur stopped chewing. His fork hovered in the air. The room went silent. Jean MacArthur, his wife, gasped. MacArthur's face went white, then red, then a stony gray. He slowly put his fork down. The emperor had been dethroned, not by a Chinese army, not by a Soviet bomb, but by the stroke of a pen from a haberdasher in Washington, D.C. The little man, MacArthur whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and hatred. The little man actually did it. He looked at his wife. Jeannie, he said, we're going home. But in Washington, Harry Truman went back to bed. For the first time in 6 months, he slept soundly. He had likely committed political suicide. He had enraged half the country. But he had saved the Republic. The next day, the storm would break. But tonight, the captain was back in charge of the ship. April 19th, 1951. The United States Capitol. Washington, D.C. felt less like a capital and more like a Roman amphitheater awaiting a gladiator. The firing of Douglas MacArthur had not silenced him. It had turned him into a martyr. The reaction from the American public had been nuclear. The White House mailroom was buried under an avalanche of hate mail. Telegrams poured in demanding Truman's impeachment. In San Gabriel, California, an effigy of the president was doused in gasoline and burned while a crowd cheered. Flags were flown at upside-down half-mast. Harry Truman sat alone in the private residence of the White House, listening to the radio. He was the most hated man in America. His approval rating had plummeted to 22%, lower than Nixon's would be on the day he resigned. They want my head, Bess, Truman told his wife, pouring a stiff drink. They think I killed Santa Claus. On the radio, the announcer's voice was breathless. General MacArthur has entered the House chamber. The applause is deafening. It has been going on for 10 minutes. Members of Congress are weeping openly. MacArthur had returned to conquer Rome. He stood at the podium of the House of Representatives, bathed in adulation. He wore a simple jacket, no medals. He looked frail, noble, a warrior wronged by petty bureaucrats. He spoke for 34 minutes. It was a masterpiece of political theater. He painted a picture of a world where victory was simple, where courage was enough, and where he had been betrayed. I have just left your fighting sons in Korea, MacArthur intoned, his voice breaking perfectly. They have met all tests there, and I can report to you without reservation that they are splendid in every way. And then, the finale, the line that would be etched into history. I'm closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all of my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plane at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular Barack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. The chamber erupted. Grown men sobbed. It was mass hysteria. In the White House, Truman switched off the radio. He looked at his aide. That, Truman said, his voice dripping with acid, was 100% bullshit. Truman knew what came next. The ticker tape parade in New York City. 7 million people, more than for Eisenhower, more than for Lindbergh, lined the streets to cheer the general. It looked like the end of Harry Truman. It looked like MacArthur was destined for the White House, carried there on a wave of populist fury. But Truman had one weapon left. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a speech. It was the truth. Let them cheer, Truman told his staff. Let him have his parades. And then we're going to put him on the stand. We're going to put him under oath. And we're going to let the American people see that the emperor has no clothes. May 1951, the Senate hearings. The MacArthur hearings were supposed to be the general's victory lap. The Republicans planned to use them to destroy Truman and prove that the war in Korea was a failure of political will. MacArthur testified first. He was arrogant. He was confident. He repeated his mantra, "There is no substitute for victory." He argued that bombing China was the only way to win. But then, the Truman administration began its counterattack. They didn't send politicians. They sent soldiers. General Omar Bradley took the stand, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man who commanded as much respect as MacArthur, but without the ego. The senators asked him, why not bomb China? Why not expand the war? Why was MacArthur wrong? Bradley adjusted his glasses. He spoke calmly, without theatrics. Frankly, Bradley said, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. The room went silent. The wrong enemy, Bradley repeated. China is not the main threat. The Soviet Union is. If we commit our entire military to a land war in China, we leave Europe wide open. We leave our own shores undefended. MacArthur's plan doesn't lead to victory. It leads to World War III. Then came General George Marshall, the architect of victory in World War II. He testified that MacArthur's demands for atomic weapons and expanding the war would have isolated the United States from all its allies. We would have stood alone, Marshall said, and we would have risked a nuclear exchange that would destroy civilization. Day by day, the air began to leak out of the MacArthur balloon. The American people began to see the difference between a hero and a strategist. MacArthur wanted a glorious fight. Truman wanted to prevent Armageddon. The testimony revealed that MacArthur had ignored intelligence, that he had been surprised by the Chinese, that his home by Christmas promise was a delusion. The hearings dragged on for weeks. By the end, the crowds following MacArthur had thinned. The ticker tape had been swept away. The hysteria faded, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the nuclear age. MacArthur didn't fade away, as he promised. He tried to run for president in 1952. He gave speeches. He rallied crowds. But the magic was gone. The Republican Party, sensing that he was too volatile, chose another general instead, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who knew how to take orders. Truman had won. He had destroyed his own popularity to save the Constitution. January 1953. The departure. Harry Truman's last day in office. He walked through the empty Oval Office. He touched the globe that stood in the corner. He had made the hardest decisions in history. The atom bomb, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, and the firing of Caesar. He walked out to the train station to catch the train back to Independence, Missouri. He expected a quiet departure. He left office with the lowest approval rating in history. But when he got to the station, there was a crowd. Not millions, but thousands. Ordinary people. They weren't cheering a hero. They were thanking a man. "Give him hell, Harry," someone shouted. Truman smiled. He tipped his hat. "I just told the truth," he yelled back. And they thought it was hell. Epilogue. The verdict of history. Years passed. The passions of 1951 cooled. General Douglas MacArthur lived out his days in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. He remained a symbol of a certain kind of American martial glory, brilliant, vain, and uncompromising. When he died in 1964, he was given a hero's funeral. Harry Truman lived in his grandfather's house in Missouri. He built a library. He took morning walks. He refused to sit on corporate boards because he didn't want to commercialize the presidency. But as the decades rolled on, historians began to look back at 1951 with new eyes. They looked at the archives. They looked at the risks. They realized that if MacArthur had his way, he likely would have triggered a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Millions would have died. Europe might have fallen. They realized that Truman's stubborn, unpopular decision to fire the most popular man in America was, in fact, one of the most courageous acts of political leadership in the history of the Republic. Truman established a precedent that stands to this day. In the United States of America, the military answers to the people. The gun answers to the ballot box. The general answers to the president. In 1961, shortly before his death, Truman was visited by a reporter. The reporter asked him about MacArthur. "Mr. President," the reporter asked, "do you have any regrets about firing him?" Truman was old now. His hair was white, but his eyes behind the thick glasses were as sharp as they were on that rainy night in 1950. "Regrets?" Truman scoffed. He poured 2 bourbons and handed one to the reporter. "Son," Truman said, "I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of the BTCH, although he was. I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't do it to save my hide. I did it to save the Constitution." Truman took a sip of his drink and looked out the window at the quiet street of Independence. "And if I had to do it all over again," Truman smiled, "I'd do it in a heartbeat. Now, drink up. The history books can sort out the rest." And so they did. The end.